Hey y'all, I'm Shauna. Welcome in and welcome back to the channel and welcome to a new video. I have been flirting with the idea of talking about more books on the channel, and we're going to give it a try today. The book we're going to talk about is The Day the World Stops Shopping by J.B Mackinnon, and we're going to we're going to talk about it. This video is not so much, is this a masterful work of nonfiction? Yes, I'll talk about critiques, core concepts, and what I like and don't about it, but ultimately this video is more about what I recommend it, and importantly as well, what I've learned and who might this book be for. We'll get to the final recommendation at the end, and let's get started with the concept of the book. This book poses the question, what if the world cut shopping by 25%? And the author goes with this idea of 25% because modern global financial disasters or problems saw a decrease of consumer spending by 20% or less. The Great Depression was about 20%. The late 2000s recession was about 15%. The Finnish recession, or sorry, the Finnish depression was about 15% as well. So a decrease of 25% would be pretty significant. McKinnon doesn't trace this question in a way that I anticipated. I expected this to be more like you ever watch those shows on the History Channel where day one, week one, and it kind of portrays the progression linearly from a day zero. This book explores the idea, but number one, it's not all doom and gloom. And number two, he explores this idea through concepts. The chapters are more thematic than a chronological timeline. As an example, chapter two is called We Don't Shop Equally, so we won't stop equally, and primarily focuses on a woman in Ecuador. He uses her as a way in to talk about her lifestyle and what a reduction in consumption might look like. So he talks about how Ecuador is considered a one planet lifestyle, meaning that globally we're using resources at 1.7 times the rate that we have them. So, current people or the current climate in Ecuador, that country as a country, lives on the equivalent of if the entire world were to live like Ecuador, we would be using the resources of our planet. In comparison, if the whole world were to live like Canada, we would need 4 Earths, and if the whole world lived like the US, we would need 5. It's quite a pleasant chapter, and the author does portray Fernanda, that's the woman, her lifestyle as a downgrade in consumption. He says, for those in richer countries, life would seem inadequate. Hot water doesn't run from the taps in their apartment. They have an on the spot electrical heating system for their shower. Their kids share a bedroom. The family has a fridge and washing machine, but no dryer. The husband's Christmas bonus is paid to them not in money, but goods. The family has one desktop computer they share, and only the adults have cell phones. While he does talk about the inconveniences of her lifestyle, he overall portrays Ecuador as a bit idyllic. And idyllic because life is simpler and people do seem happier because of it, at least according to the author. There are a myriad of topics in this book, and many of which are very interesting. One of the ones that caught my eye was about how the decrease in consumption would not mean an end to fast fashion. And at first I was thinking, what do you mean? We'll talk more about that later. He talks about how the end of growth isn't an end to economics. People are still buying stuff. And importantly, according to him, the world wouldn't descend into chaos, or at least there are ways around that. The author does argue that consumption is the greatest threat to our environment. And even though that's true, people are hesitant to recommend decreasing consumption or production as solutions to the climate crisis. He says that greening of consumption has been helpful and things would be worse if we didn't, but it hasn't slowed down consumption. He also says every gain in our attempt to reduce carbon emissions has lost or neutralized by the growth of our global consumption. One of the most striking examples of how consumption has been interwoven into our society or into Yeah, society, culture, politics was in the pandemic, and he was highlighting how people were debating what loss of life would be tolerable to keep things open. He says, by then, this is a direct quote, the idea that shopping is not just a pastime or a distraction, but the only thing standing between us and the fall of civilization was perfectly normal to our ears. We must stop shopping, but we can't. And this consumer dilemma, quite simply, is the question of whether we can sustain human life on Earth. He has some moments like this, but the book is surprisingly upbeat. And I would argue that it is an overall positive take on what I think a lot of people would presume would be a slow descent into chaos or maybe a fast descent into chaos, and that a sudden and dramatic decrease in consumption would lead to turmoil and upheaval. He shares a lot of examples of how there is reasons to be optimistic, like a company that has created technology to dissolve fabrics and find ways to recycle them. So you would put in a polyester sweater, it would break it down into a pellet, and that would then be able to be turned into more clothes or turned back into clothes or other things. There are companies trying to help consumers shift their identities as consumers. There's another great example of a marketing firm that bought out all of the advertising space in a London subway station in 2016. This book is from 2021. And they filled that space with cats. He didn't show any photos in the book, but I'll show you some on the screen. I found this example, or I found what this looked like. And this marketing firm says that we need people who currently work in advertising to reshape the story of consumerism and sell alternatives to instant gratification with the same energy and ingenuity they are currently applying to consumer products. He argues that they could sell us deconsuming, volunteering, and reconnecting with nature. Obviously, this doesn't happen because who's going to pay for it? This book overall seems quite hopeful, and if you leave this book or you finish this book, you might leave hopeful as well. Hope is a necessary ingredient in fighting the climate crisis and changing our consuming habits because if we truly believe that all hope is lost, that's when people give in the towel or throw in the towel. People can give up. And if it is all doom and gloom, it can lead to that as well. Like, what's the point? Although sometimes doom and gloom does help mobilize people, it makes them angry. There is the counterpoint that if things are too hopeful, it can make people feel like they don't need to act. I think how people react to the positive message of this book is going to be individual, whether that's feeling reinvigorated in the work that you're doing or feeling like more work isn't necessary. I did find that there were some creative solutions or things I hadn't heard about before, like that marketing firm in 2016. And I did feel a little bit more hopeful that there are more people who care about the climate crisis or consumption than I sometimes believe. Sometimes when you hear all the negative news, it can feel like nobody cares, which is not true. I wanted to talk a little bit about the critique next. My biggest overarching critique of this. This book, I think, provides a little bit too much cushioning. And I don't say that to be nitpicky, but uh, I think an example is helpful. So, in one of his chapters, he's talking with an economist, and the economist shows an example of the Canadian economy anyway, because the person is Canadian, about how it is possible to have degrowth and also not have things descend into chaos. And while it's great, he shows people the possibility that there isn't catastrophic job loss, that supply chains don't descend into chaos. You know, the stock market doesn't crash entirely, which I think might be some people's perceptions of what happens. Or there's mass homelessness as people can't afford to pay for their homes and their basic necessities of life because they don't have jobs. The Economist describes this as an enduring Canadian recession. Let's say that it truly is possible for this to play out. The key ingredient here is intervention. It's almost a sick joke to present this as a reality when so much intervention is going to be required before things happen or very quickly. And at this point in time, because my government is, and many governments around the world are tied to the idea of growth, Very few, without tremendous pressure, are, in my opinion, unwilling to just one day just go, let's advocate degrowth. Let's just go do that thing. The politicians in the Canadian landscape, the American landscape are tied to their funders and their backers. And this is assuming that people aren't selfish and just trying to make more money and profit individually. Lobbyists are also extremely successful at lobbying for things. I mean, oversimplification, but there's a certain concentration of power and wealth that does or is very effective at keeping the government doing the things that they want the government to do. To his point, or perhaps to his credit, a lot of people don't see a way out of the current situation in terms of this steady growth. Like people see capitalism and the way it currently exists is so intertwined with our way of life that there is just no way out of it. There is no alternative. And what he presents is all right, perhaps not a total death to capitalism and not a total death to our way of life, but we can like keep to our similar program. He shows that capitalism doesn't totally have to be dead. Stock markets can exist, millionaires can exist, people can still make money, but it's just a little bit less. This is overall an extremely gentle critique of capitalism, and I don't think he actually helps people envision a place in which some of his solutions are actually viable. How do you convince a government to be okay with degrowth? How do you get people mobile and active enough in order to make this a reality? Because it's not going to be a reality without pressure. He manages to critique some of consumption with skirting around the critique of capitalism and the ills that it can bring. I kind of get it. Also, especially given the North American economy and people's assumption that, like, capitalism has to die in order for things to change, and then the thing that goes in its place is what communism is the opposite of capitalism. I think that's where some people's brains go, and there is a big fear of communism, and so he doesn't even entertain that word and provides people with a little bit of hope that the things that they're comfortable and familiar with don't actually have to disappear entirely. What he doesn't say is that if we actually want the scenarios depicted in the book, or some of them anyway, people have to do something and demand these things. Well, yes, the author also says that, the entire world doesn't shop equally, so we don't stop equally. His example of that is Fernanda in Ecuador. And he doesn't actually talk about the race, gender, or class effects of how these things will come to be potentially, even in just the first few months. When we actually look at what happens in the immediate first few months of such a decline, even in just retail spending, it would not be felt evenly. The effects would vary across socioeconomic classes, gender, and race, largely reflecting existing inequalities in the labor market and spending patterns. Higher income households typically account for a disproportionate share of discretionary spending. These consumers might voluntarily cut back out of new values or simply to reduce access, while wealthy individuals would lose some retail driven investment or business income. They generally have financial cushions to weather the change. In contrast, lower income families already spend most of their budget on necessities, not discretionary retail. They may not significantly cut their modest non essential purchases because they are minimal to begin with. However, they would be vulnerable on the employment side. Retail and manufacturing jobs are often low wage. A sales slump could eliminate many hourly retail positions like cashiers or stockists or stockers and manufacturing line jobs. These workers often or are more likely to live paycheck to paycheck, and they would struggle with sudden unemployment. Without robust safety nets, inequality could worsen as the working class loses jobs and income, while higher classes simply trim luxury spending. Retail sector job losses would disproportionately affect women, who make up larger shares of retail sales associates, merchandisers, and garment factory workers globally. For example, in the early 2020 retail downturn, women's unemployment spiked higher than men's. In a retail focused contraction, roles like fashion retail clerks or garment seamstresses would be among the first cut. On the other hand, male dominated sectors, construction or heavy industry, might be less directly affected. This could temporarily narrow the gender wage gap if higher paid male workers remain employed, but at the cost of greater female economic insecurity. Additionally, if women are the primary managers of household spending, they might bear the stress of stretching budget and making do with less for their families, which is an often unseen emotional labor. The racial impacts would vary by country, but most often mirror job distribution. In Western countries, minority workers are overrepresented in low wage retail and warehouse jobs. For instance, Black and Latino workers in the US hold a substantial share of retail, hospitality, and warehousing positions. These groups saw outsized job losses in 2020. One stark statistic from late 2020, all of the net US job losses in December 2020 were among women, almost entirely Black and Latina women, reflecting their concentration in vulnerable service roles. A store closure in urban and suburban retail centers could hit minority communities hardest, both through job cuts and potential retail deserts if local stores shutter. I could continue, but I think that's enough for now. Or that's enough to get my point across about some of the inequities and inequalities that would persist worse or worsen if these things were to continue. Most of this is from evidence that we saw during the global pandemic in 2020 or like stats from 2020, 2021 that were available when he was making his book. This is stuff he doesn't actually get into, which I think is a huge, I don't even want to say missed opportunity, but a huge missing piece. Some of his chapters are a little bit irrelevant. Like he has a chapter on whales that it is basically ocean life would be better without humans. Yeah, great. So what do we do about that? There's also a chapter on family businesses and how like this could be a potential model going forward, but he's talking about businesses that have weathered storms for hundreds of years and these businesses are able to put other things besides profit as their main goals. And part of why he was talking about this was because in the West, specifically in the US, there are certain ways of thinking about business and money that a lot of Americans believe are normal, but are not in fact normal. And it's not growth at all costs or like the first and most important thing is money. There are other ways of viewing business. And he does show some examples or some counter narratives and how different cultures and different social customs can also affect how people perceive business or perceive doing business and what a good model of business should or could look like. So, some of these family businesses that have been around for hundreds of years were able to weather storms like the pandemic and may, in fact, have alternatives to just making money or alternative goals, but they have family fortunes to lean back on. They may not be like one of the examples was a family business that has been making $10 million a year for the past decade, and that might not be $100 million, but $10 million is still enough of a cushion to be able to allow that business to decide to have other values. How does that actually help an average reader who is not a business person? Or if you are a business person and you own your own business, you don't have a decade of experience or $10 million behind you in order to get your business up and running. My feeling is that if you read this book, you'll probably leave it feeling good and you may feel less inclined to buy things and it may make you feel good about not buying things or buying less. I think you will gain knowledge from this book, but I don't think that this book alone equips you with what to do to get to this fantasy or imagined reality. I had 3 favorite chapters in this book, and I wanna talk about them now. The first is on air conditioning. He talks about how it was introduced in the US, and at first, it was a challenge to get people interested in air conditioning because people didn't actually see the temperature of their homes as a problem. One of the people who was an early promoter of air conditioning said the only time we will know anything about heat waves or Arctic air blasts will be when he exposes himself to the natural discomforts of the outdoors. This chapter is all about how life is riddled with changing expectations and changing ideas of normalcy, but also patterns and constructions that can greatly change or adapt or alter people's consuming habits. And the author quotes a scholar, Elizabeth Shove, who says that this happens largely under three umbrellas: cleanliness, convenience, and comfort. Home heating and cooling change standards of comfort. Next is the fast fashion chapter. I don't think, if you've been here, I don't think you'd be too surprised to hear that I would enjoy that chapter. There is some interesting information and stats here, like how the secondhand marketplace represents 10% of the total fashion marketplace, or just about there. One of the most alarming things to me about this book are some people who are business people within the secondhand marketplace space, people he calls resale advocates. And some of these people envision a world, or what they want is for goods to flow. That's a direct quote. Where goods come into our lives when we need them and out when they don't. Flow includes a lot of things, including subscriptions and rentals, sharing networks. And this genre of goods, according to the author, makes a promise: we can use up far fewer resources while also acquiring and disposing of products as quickly or more quickly than ever before. Some of these advocates believe that consumption is going to increase, and they also want it to increase. And they think that once goods flow, that people will get used to things flowing and want that flow in their life. And I think it's intended, at least the idea is, to mimic fast fashion and continue buying habits of the present, but be able to do it in more of a secondhand capacity. The coolest thing in this chapter was um, this company called Born Again Technology, who apparently found a way to recycle fabrics by dissolving them. So they dissolve clothing fabrics and turn them back into raw materials that can be reused. And about 80% of clothing meets the criteria to be used for said technology. I'm just imagining some of these, what have become dump sites in the global south. You can take all of these clothes, or even 80% of them, which is a huge portion, and then turn them back into resources. This is also why the author doesn't think that fast fashion is going to be over. If you can repurpose these resources into more clothes, people can continue to be consuming at high rates. You're just not extracting as many raw materials anymore. My favorite chapter is the chapter that discusses what do we become if we stop being consumers? The author argues that our primary role in society today is as a consumer. So, if we stop doing that, we'll become something else. One of the people interviewed argued that people are consumers who vote, but we could become citizens who consume. The chapter included alternatives like becoming participants in society, and the author looks at one organization that encourages this participation behavior, and they talk about some of the barriers that they found when trying to kind of make this or help people bring this out of themselves. I like this chapter a lot, not just because there was feel good examples, but it made me question my own capacity or my own desire for decentering consumer, or being a consumer, from my own identity. We are not born consumers, we are taught to be consumers. And it's consuming that allows us to show who we are. This idea that consumption is tied to our identity is ingrained in so many of us. If we practice different roles, though, our identity can shift. What this chapter gets at is an alternative system, an alternative identity and way of thinking about ourselves. And this was just the best creative exercise, would be how to decenter consumption from my identity, how I think about myself, but also in how I act and operate, and where I center my identity. Because, just for argument's sake, if I choose to not put my identity on what I consume, or showing people who I am with my stuff, what are alternatives? And I'm going to give you some alternatives, because participant was one. Political activist could be another. I mean, political activism needs to kind of be there in any of the worlds that we create, I think. Funny that he didn't suggest that. For a little bit of novelty, And to kind of keep with his structure of the book, I created a list that resembles that. So, examples, we could be stewards, caretaker of places, tools, ecosystems, or histories. We could be menders or makers, but in terms of makers, producers of value beyond money, like community kitchens, Zines, open source projects. We could be sharers, builders of common access, starting lending libraries for tools, toys, books. The sky's kind of the limit with that. We could be hosts, we could be maintainers, the overlooked backbones of a lot of society. We could be learners, people who trade knowledge. We could be teaching or learning in peer classes or teaching circles. We could be advocates. We could be storytellers. So, would I recommend this book and to whom? So, when I think about, did I like a book? What I recommended? I think about it on two levels first. Would I reread it and would I use it as a resource? Would I reread it? Probably not. I got what I needed to out of it. There were some good thought experiments that I had, but I probably wouldn't reread it. I also probably wouldn't reference it again or want such convenient access to it that I would want it on hand. These two factors for me factor into whether I would buy a book. And buying a book is my own personal testament to loving a book, which is why we're talking about them now. I did take some notes and I will reference these notes in the future, most likely, because there was some good information, but I wouldn't take out this book to reference them, nor do I think if I didn't take notes, I would check out this book to get that information to reference, if that makes sense. This book is readily available at my library, and even if somebody had it out, and I had to wait 3 or 4 weeks, 6 weeks even, it's not, uh, important enough for me to be unable to wait that time period in order to get it if I wanted to reread it. So that shows to me that this was an okay book, which is fine, and I think how a lot of reading goes. I think that if you're somebody in who would want or benefit from an upbeat read that's kind of consumption adjacent, you would probably like this book if it's available at your library. I wouldn't go out and suggest that one buys this book because I didn't find it personally important enough to buy. This is a book that I would consider something that helps to keep me in a conscious consumer headspace, kind of supporting or keeping me in the kind of headspace that reminds me of values and things that I care about and supports that overall goal and lifestyle. If you are somebody who is well versed in consumer culture or sustainability, you probably aren't going to be learning a lot from this. However, a lot of his chapters are full of anecdotes and personal stories that would probably be novel, although I don't know that that would entice you to read this book generally. After a while, all of these anecdotes, I mean, each chapter started with an anecdote to get people into the chapter and then it would transition to the core of the chapter. That got a bit tedious for me near the end, and some of it I'm like, all right, I just want to know what we're talking about. And I didn't like all the stories equally, but some of them I really liked, and I enjoyed those chapters most, even though they didn't have entire bearing on the core idea of that chapter. They're just interesting. So I would consider this more of a pleasure read than an educational read, although you probably would learn something. If you were looking for an educational read, this would not be a recommendation. If you had this available at your library and you asked me, hey, Shauna, should I check it out? I might say, yeah, you have very little to lose. And the kind of upbeat take of this, I think, is one of the most drawing things to me about this book. If, however, you are somebody who is in the anti capitalist, anti consumer side of things, and you are fairly well versed in that literature, in that world, this book is probably not enough and may in fact piss you off. So that's my take. That's everything for me today. Have you read this book? What were your thoughts on it? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching and hope to see you again around here soon in a new one. Bye.